Oregon and Michigan, two teams with college football playoff expectations at the beginning of the season. They got some things to figure out. They've got some questions to answer. That and much, much more in a Week 2 mega reaction. This is Big Nation. Let's get it rolling.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Folks, this is an educational process week by week, right? We learn something each and every single week about not just a couple of teams in the Big Ten, about every single team in the Big Ten. Welcome to another edition of Big Nation. This is Big Nation 7. Welcome to a Monday Week 2 mega reaction. The format of the shows, as I mentioned on Thursday, the Monday night show will be a reaction, an in-depth reaction to everything that happened over on Friday and on Saturday, some Fridays, but obviously mostly Saturdays here within the conference this year. And then that Thursday show each and every single week is going to be that mega preview show, previewing some of the best Big Ten games, picks, and previews, where I'll be picking every game across the Big Ten slate. So welcome in to this Monday edition. 2 weeks in the books. We got a long way to go, but some things, are they getting a little bit clearer? Yeah, maybe for some teams. Are things a little bit confusing and a little bit murky for others? Yeah, you bet they are. All right, let's get into the game plan, what we are going to be talking about here on this edition of Big Nation. Iowa falling at the hands to Iowa State at home after holding a 13-0 lead in that specific football game. What's the status? What is the progress of Iowa and specifically their offense? Because I said last week, this game against Iowa State is a little bit of a measuring stick for Tim Lester and that offensive unit. We'll be talking about that. Was not able to react to that one on Saturday, so we'll have a reaction to that Iowa State game as well. Two coaches were hired about a year and change ago, not quite 2 years ago, and they're always going to be compared against each other. Matt Rhule and Luke Fickell. Where do those two teams, where do those two coaches, where do those two programs stand against each other right now? Michigan, after their 31-12 loss to the Texas Longhorns, they've certainly got some things to fix. And now they've kind of condensed themselves into a little bit of a two-game season, because that game in 2 weeks against USC looks a little bit different now than it did at the beginning of the season, doesn't it? Right? So they got to get some things fixed. What do they need to get fixed before they take on the USC Trojans in a couple of weeks? What do they need to get right against Arkansas State this weekend? Is Oregon okay? Are they going to be all right? Okay, it took tooth and nail. It took everything for them to become Idaho State champions, to win against the Vandals in week 1. A last-second walk-off field goal to get their first ever win against the Boise State Broncos. Is this a program that's going to be okay? They've got their Civil War game coming up, and then they step into Big Ten Conference play. How is the mood? How are the vibes surrounding this Ducks program? All right, so on the Monday shows, we're going to start things off with two segments. Our week-by-week Warriors. Of course, this week it's going to be our Week 2 Warriors, looking at some of the best performances in the Big Ten Conference. And then we're going to go a little bit more in-depth across the conference with some Saturday storylines, some big talking points and storylines that certainly stuck out to me. But first, we are going to start with our Week 2 Warriors, the sum of the best performances within the Big Ten Conference this particular week. I want to start in East Lansing, Michigan. You know, a lot of big questions coming in with the Spartans this season. Who is going to step up and be that big-time target for a big-time quarterback in Aiden Childs? Was it going to be Montori Foster? Was it going to be Antonio Gates Jr.? Was it going to be an Alante Brown? Who was it going to be? Okay, there were a lot of questions. You know, we all thought, yeah, it looks like it should be Montori Foster, but is he a true number one type of target? at wide receiver that Aiden Childs can consistently rely on? Well, they may have a wide receiver one. And this guy, if you watched our Michigan State preview with Brendan Moore of Spartans Illustrated, right? And if you were kind of digging into and reading some of the tea leaves throughout spring and then throughout fall in Michigan State, you had a feeling that 4-star freshman Nick Marsh was going to be able to step up and at least compete to be in that type of role. And what a performance against the Maryland Terrapins, the first Big Ten victory for Jonathan Smith as head coach of the Green and White. 8 catches, 194 yards, and a touchdown. And boy, was that touchdown big. A 77-yarder to tie that one up late. 24-24 against the Maryland Terrapins. Look, Aiden Childs is taking us through a roller coaster right now. I think, with his ability to push the ball down the field, we saw, I think, some better things from Aiden Childs in this victory against Maryland, but this is a team in Michigan State. This is a quarterback in Aiden Childs. You need to protect the football. You need to protect the football. You can't turn it over. 3 interceptions, but 3 touchdowns. A little bit of a roller coaster we may be riding in East Lansing, Michigan. But if he has his target in Nick Marsh, I think that's going to make this Michigan State offense hum a little bit more, because now you start to look at some of these spots. They got a really good running back tandem. Aiden Childs, if he can protect the football, I'm going to keep harping on that, man, because it needs to be talked about. If he can protect the football, he's proven through 2 games that he can make some pretty good throws, specifically in this last game against Maryland. And if he has that target that he can go to, remember, you got Jack Velling, a really good tight end as well. If you have those 2 guys kind of leading the way with a really good running back tandem, all of a sudden things are kind of coming together offensively for the Michigan State Spartans. I'm going to go to units. Okay, there are 2 units that really stick out to me. First, let's start on the offensive side of the football. Look, I don't care who you're playing. If you put up over 700 yards of total offense and you have the performance from quarterback Curtis Rourke, from all of these guys, from Justice Ellison, from Elijah Surratt, all of these guys at Indiana. I know Western Illinois is just an FCS program, but man, this Indiana offense looks like it's coming together. Man, do they look explosive, which it shouldn't be surprising to you. It certainly isn't surprising to me, considering the background and the track record of Curt Cignetti and this offensive coaching staff, and then the talent that they were able to bring in this offseason via the transfer portal as well. Now, they got a big game on the horizon. They got to go on the Rose Bowl, got to go to the Rose Bowl, to take on the UCLA Bruins. All of a sudden, you get that in the W column. They got a game against Maryland here coming up. If they're able to capitalize on that, and Maryland not getting it done against Michigan State, maybe shows us that Indiana could be in a position to win that football game, right? You're starting to get things really rolling for the Indiana Hoosiers right now. That offense is so fun to watch. They got a lot of really explosive players on that unit as well. I cannot wait to watch some more Indiana football here the rest of the season. That's offense. Man, I want to talk about defense, and you got to talk about that performance by Tony White's defense, that Nebraska Cornhuskers defense against Colorado. Look, anybody with half a brain could have told you that something like this probably could have happened. Now, I predicted that Nebraska was going to eat up front. Now, maybe they ate a little bit more than I expected. You're looking at 6 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, forcing 2 turnovers and holding Colorado to just 16 yards on the ground. Tony White's defense can keep Nebraska in just about every single football game they play this season, maybe minus Ohio State. Ohio State is just superiorly talented on offense, defense, special teams, right? Well, compared to maybe almost every other team in the Big Ten, they have been so impressive at the top, and there's been maybe some other teams with some questions as well. But outside of that matchup, you look at the rest of the schedule for Nebraska, and this defense, they are killers up front. They are killers at linebacker. There are great experienced players back there in the secondary. Now, I think a lot of attention based on those sack numbers, those TFL numbers, are going to go to the guys up front. Now, a lot of credit certainly should go to those guys, but one guy that certainly stood out to me, and it should be no surprise to anybody, is corner Tommy Hill. Okay, with Tommy Hill was able to match up against Travis Hunter and keep him in check, right? That was a big part of limiting that one bullet in the holster for Colorado, right? People were saying on the broadcast at NBC, Tommy Hill, he's a first-round guy. Okay, and I think having that lockdown corner with the Ty Robinsons, the Nash Hutmakers, the Jamari Butlers, etc. up front, then you add, Cameron Lenhart and Principal Uman Mielenman at the quarterback. You got MJ Sherman out there. You just look at all of the pieces and all of the depth across this Nebraska defense. You have a lockdown type of guy with Tommy Hill. You combine it with what they have up front. It's a complete defense. You can argue whether Nebraska as a football team, as a complete team, is back. Okay, I know that second half left a little bit to be desired, but this defense, the black shirts, there's no debate. They are back. This is a true Nebraska black shirts defense. And if this offense takes care of the football, makes some plays down the field, they are going to be in and have a chance to win almost every single game they play this season. And that is going to be very exciting, certainly for the fans of the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Staying on the defensive side of the ball, but headed over to Champaign, Illinois. What a huge win for Illinois over the Kansas Jayhawks. And a big reason for that particular win is the play of Xavier Scott. 8 tackles, a strip sack, 2 interceptions, and he took one of those interceptions all the way back to the House of Orange in front of a sellout crowd at Memorial Stadium in Champaign, Illinois. When we talk about Illinois, and when we talked about Illinois, specifically in this matchup against Kansas, the big question I had coming in is, can they avoid a repeat performance of last year where Jalen Daniels and this Kansas offense was able to move the ball up and down and up and down one more time and up and down the field. And this secondary looks so much improved. The Scotts, we know Miles Scott, Xavier Scott, we have Terrence Brooks, the transfer over there. Matthew Bailey, right, is healthy. All of a sudden, this secondary is looking really, really good. And Xavier Scott and his advantageous opportunistic play back there, forcing turnovers. This looks like a defense that's going to be very opportunistic and aggressive to be able to force some turnovers to give their offense a better situation as well. I really like their linebacking group, right? That has not really been much of a question. Seth Kozman, Dylan Rosiak. I know Gabe Akis really has moved, to a more defensive line spot, but he can be kind of a hybrid, an outside linebacker, defensive end type of guy as well. And that defensive line, I think it's a little bit ahead of schedule from where I had them early in the year. This is an Illinois defense that if they can start to really put this thing together, we talked preseason about how this offense is probably the better unit of the two. Now, if Aaron Henry's unit continues to look better like this, guys, this is an Illinois team that you better start believing in. This is an Illinois team. A couple of weeks from now, they got a Friday night matchup against Nebraska. Okay, that could be very fun. That could be very interesting in that Fox Friday night time slot as well. But if this defense continues to improve, this is an Illinois team I think that could surprise some people. Never doubt this Illinois team as long as they're head coached by Brett Bielema. Let's move to the middle of the Big Ten, all the way out west in the Big Ten. Let's talk about Will Rogers, the quarterback over at Washington. Now, I know they haven't played the best of opponents in the first 2 weeks. You can look at Weber State, Jonah Coleman getting a Week 1 Warrior Award in Week 1, by the way. And then now Week 2, we're looking at Will Rogers, right? Weber State and then Eastern Michigan. 21 of 26, 261 yards, and 4 touchdowns for Will Rogers. Now, you can tell just by that stat line that he is extremely efficient and he's very accurate as well. Now, you turn on the tape and I see a lot of the same stuff. I love what Jed Fish and Brendan Carroll is doing, putting Will Rogers in position to succeed. I think another reason why Will is having success is because of what we've seen out of Jonah Coleman so far running the football, right? Not all of the pressure is on Will Rogers to be able to make plays, maybe like it was when he was the quarterback at Mississippi State. and you see him very accurate. Like there was that deep ball that went for a touchdown. That was right on the money. And he is just in rhythm. You can tell he's getting a lot more confidence throwing the football. I love what's going on in Seattle right now. Washington is one of those teams. Look, you got to take into account who they've played. Okay, but then again, there have been other Big Ten teams that have struggled against FCS teams, that have struggled against G5 teams, and Washington has taken care of business. Washington is old TCB right now, and Will Rogers is a big reason why. This is a Husky team that's kind of lying in the weeds right now. Not a lot of people are talking about them, right? People are talking about USC. People are talking about Nebraska, and Washington is just kind of lying there. Okay, they're going to have a game against Northwestern here coming up. They got to go on the road to Rutgers. All of a sudden, you could wake up, and this could be an undefeated, very confident Washington Huskies football team led by a very experienced quarterback in Will Rogers when Michigan comes to the greatest setting in college football in the first Saturday in October. So just watch out for those Washington Huskies led by Will Rogers. I love everything that's happening right now. Look, they don't have certainly the wide receivers that they did last year, but everything is just working together. Jed Fish and the staff have done a great job at identifying what they have and maybe what they don't have and taking that and creating something out of it. It's looked pretty good so far here during this season. Our last Week 2 Warrior goes the way of the Rutgers Scarlet Knight star running back Kyle Monangai against the Akron Zips. 27 carries, 208 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Just another ho-hum type of performance from Kyle Monangai, right? As long as he keeps running the football this way, Rutgers is going to be an extremely tough out in the Big Ten Conference right now. You know, I know there was a lot of smoke for Rutgers early in the season. Rutgers is another team, right? Certainly the not two most high-profile opponents with Howard and Akron right off the gate, but I'll say it again, some other teams have struggled against FCS teams. Some other teams have struggled against Group of 5 teams. Rutgers taking care of business. I think Ethan Kaliakmanis and the throw game is better this season so far through 2 games. I know it's early and they haven't played many teams. We'll see what happens when they step into Big Ten Conference play. But I think that kind of helps out the run game as well, because last year it was, man, if Kyle Monangai and a little bit of Gavin Wimsatt, if they didn't get the run game going, they didn't have the throw game, if teams loaded the box and they had trouble running the football, they couldn't hit that play over the top. You know, now with Dymere Miller on this team and now with maybe a little bit more depth at the wide receiver position and a quarterback that, you know, look, I'm not saying Ethan Kaliakmanis is going to break any records or anything, but I think he provides a better passing option over the top when the box does get crowded for Rutgers. But Kyle Monangai is just plain and simple. He's one of the most talented running backs in the Big Ten. He's extremely underrated nationally, right? He was last year. He is this year, and certainly well-deserving for a Week 1 Warrior Award. I want to head in now to my Saturday storylines, things that stuck out to me on Saturday in week number 2. Minnesota. The Minnesota Golden Gophers. I was on the sideline for that North Carolina game, and I could see this passing offense maybe struggled to really get going right away in game number 1. Receivers kind of struggled to get open. Max Brosmer kind of struggled to get in a rhythm until that last drive. So he took that last drive against North Carolina, and I think he was able to take that and translated it into a Week 2 opponent that he's familiar with, right? He played in the CAA last few seasons for New Hampshire, taking on a Rhode Island team that was in that conference as well, right? We take it with a grain of salt, being an FCS opponent. But here are some things I can take away from Minnesota's performance. And 24 of 30, 271, 2 touchdowns throwing the football for Max Brosmer. I'll say this. There was a lot of distribution across a lot of different guys, and I think that's very important because I think when you've looked at this Minnesota pass game last year, preseason, and through game 1, you're like, well, who's going to step out outside of Daniel Jackson? Daniel Jackson did have 4 catches in this game, but so did Elijah Spencer, which is huge because in Minnesota country and Golden Gopher country, right, Elijah Spencer and maybe Lemeki Brockington, but they're really trying to identify Elijah Spencer to be that second guy. He had 4 catches in this game against Rhode Island. Also, Darius Taylor, who returned from injury, had 4 catches out of the backfield as well. You look at Minnesota, 12 different Golden Gophers caught a pass. Having that diversity in the pass game is certainly going to be able to help out. And Minnesota has been so predicated on a great run game. Run. And you have one of the most talented running backs, in the Big Ten in Darius Taylor in the backfield. And now if you could combine that with a legitimate passing game over the top, an efficient and accurate passing game. Some throws made by Max Brosmer in this game on Saturday were chef's kiss types of throws as well. If they can have a truly balanced offense with a good quarterback and a great to elite running back, this is a Minnesota team all of a sudden, okay? You lost a game in week 1 you should have won. Okay, 2 missed field goals by the Big Ten kicker of the year against a Power 4 opponent. They took care of business against Rhode Island. If they take care of business, keep building confidence with the win over Nevada, all of a sudden you have an Iowa team that blew a 13-0 lead against Iowa State. They're coming off of a loss. And then they come into Minneapolis in a few weeks. We'll see what Iowa does in between now and then. But all of a sudden, they come into Minneapolis. If the Gophers are able to win the Floyd of Rosedale for the second consecutive year, you're sitting at 3-1 with a victory over one of your big rivals. All of a sudden, you're feeling pretty good. This is the week-to-week roller coaster we go on in the Big Ten. It is important to not judge things too quickly, right? I talked about that in week 1. We don't overreact, but we don't ignore what happened in week 1. All of a sudden, a win over Iowa, and Minnesota could be feeling really good about themselves. That offensive line needs to continue to get better as well. But certainly, if this Gopher team can throw the football more and they can throw the football better, that's going to be very exciting, and there's going to be some more optimistic Gopher fans as well. Folks, Brett Bielema was put on this earth to do one thing and one thing only: coach Big Ten football. Never, ever, ever doubt Brett Bielema. Am I considered a doubter predicting them to go 6-6? I had them with a much better record than some people. There were some people that were predicting Illinois at 3 wins. There were some people that were predicting Illinois at 4 wins, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't even do 5-7. I said, I look what Illinois had offensively, and I know defensively there were some questions coming into this season, but I'm like, this is Brett Bielema we're talking about. Okay, he's a really good coach. He knows how to figure it out. And you look at how that defense played against the Kansas Jayhawks, and if that defense continues to improve, and then you look at the offensive side of the ball, I thought Caden Fagan could have a breakout game. Okay, he didn't really get a ton. I know he got in the end zone, but he didn't get really a ton going in the run game. I really like the confidence of Luke Altmaier that he's playing with right now, and I think it's because he's got 2 really good options over there at wide receiver. Of course, with Pat Bryant, who's, I think, really taken a step up in these first 2 games. He's looked really good. And, of course, Zachary Franklin. How about that great catch on the sideline when he's interlocked with a Kansas defender, right? Having those 2 types of weapons certainly helps. And this is a good offensive line. This is an Illinois team that all of a sudden you're starting to see things come together. If this is a team that can cap off non-conference play at 3-0, they've got a game against Nebraska. I know they have a really tough middle of the schedule. But all of a sudden, you're starting to see Illinois as maybe one of those surprises in the Big Ten. Can they pull an upset? We'll see. It should be very interesting to see Brett Bielema and the Illinois Fighting Illini. I got 2 more Saturday storylines. Folks, when you saw USC in week number 1, you saw Miller Moss really show how good of a quarterback he is. Really, it was a proving. We saw it happen against Louisville in the bowl game, and then he proved it against LSU. You can go out there, you can beat an SEC team. And when you take a look at the run game in that specific matchup against LSU, it was something to counter. We knew the pass game was the show. and the run game was kind of used to balance that out, so the defense couldn't just key in on rushing the passer or dropping guys back into coverage. And I know it's Utah State, but this run game, man, you can't let this run game get hot, because all of a sudden now, if you have a legitimate Big Ten-style run game at USC and you combine it with Miller Moss and these weapons and the play calling of Lincoln Riley, all of a sudden, this could become college football's best offense very quickly, folks. Woody Marks, 103 yards and a score. Quentin Joyner, I think, is the story, though. 2 touchdown rushes in this game, 84 yards on the ground. USC as a whole combined for 249 yards. Quentin Joyner, right? When Lincoln Riley, I've talked about this many times, when Lincoln Riley came into Los Angeles, when he was hired, he went out and got some great skill players. Okay, he got Zachariah Branch. He got Deuce Robinson, right? He got Jacoby Lane. He got a lot of these guys who are now true sophomores. Quentin Joyner was in that class as a highly regarded running back. Woody Marks, I think, just fits this offense so well. Quentin Joyner and his speed and agility and elusiveness as well really fits in. And then you've got the power of a guy like a Brian Jackson. This could be a really good run game. If this offensive line starts to get some confidence in road grading up front and this run game really starts to hit their stride, Michigan in a couple of weeks could be in for a very challenging opponent, because now all of a sudden, if you can run the football and you can run the football, all of a sudden that passing game, when people crowd the box, that passing game over the top becomes almost a guaranteed that they're going to hit a big play. All of a sudden, you kind of look at how things are coming together in Southern California, and you can start to see exactly. We talk about never doubting Brett Bielema and his ability to get a team back to win Big Ten football games. How dare you? How dare anybody doubt Lincoln Riley that he can lose a Heisman Trophy winner and then have maybe the best offense in college football the very next season? Like, there's just some things that we should expect year in and year out within the Big Ten Conference now. And Lincoln Riley having an elite offense, no matter who is the personnel, is certainly one of those boxes that we should check week in and week out. Now, there's been a lot of positives. I'm unfortunately maybe going to finish on a little bit of a down note. I want to talk about Penn State's challenge against the Bowling Green Falcons. Now, there are some things to really take away. I don't think the offense, really, you can say much about that as well. The run game was able to get going. I know Drew Aller didn't have the best stat line in the world, but I don't think the offense was really the problem. I think it is universally accepted that the defense had a fair amount of concern. And specifically this pass defense. Connor Bazelak, yes, that Connor Bazelak, former Indiana quarterback, was able to carve up Penn State in the first half specifically. Now, they seemed to get things better in the second half, even though they didn't have KJ Winston in the second half. But they seemed to make some adjustments and at least look better and be better in the second half of this game. But we know there's some newness breaking in, right? We talked about the safeties and how you feel there, but there's some newness with some transfer corners over here for Penn State. And I know that is a concern a little bit, but I think one thing that's really stood out to me so far, and I think you can even take in that great performance against West Virginia as well, this pass rush, this vaunted pass rush that we talked about in the preseason with Abdul Carter and Dennis Sutton. They had no sacks against Bowling Green, and they've combined for the same goose egg in the sack department through 2 games. Now, I know sacks isn't the be-all, end-all of getting pressure, hurries, pressures, right? That's also an important stat as well. But this is a group that we thought coming into the season was going to wreak absolute havoc. And when you look at teams like West Virginia and specifically Bowling Green, I thought that they were going to be able to get in there and disrupt this passing game. And I think that's maybe got something to do a little bit with what happened on the back end of this defense against Bowling Green. Now, the good thing is for Penn State, they got a bye week to figure it out. They got a bye week to look at the tape, figure out their problems, and then get it together and look really good against another MAC team against Kent State. You look at Penn State's schedule, it's very favorable up until the middle of the season, October 12th. Of course, they got to go to the Coliseum to play USC. And I'll say this about their pass defense. They better have that figured out when they play the USC Trojans. So that is Saturday storylines from a very fun and a very exciting week 2 of Big Ten college football. I want to move from some Saturday storylines to one big game on Saturday that I really wanted to spotlight and isolate on its own. Didn't have quite enough time on Saturday to react to it in real time shortly after the game, so I wanted to make sure I got after it here on this Monday show. Iowa's loss, 20-19 at the hands of their in-state non-conference rival, Iowa State. I think there's a good amount of things to really take away from this game. I said coming into this game, this was a big-time measuring stick for the progress of Iowa, not only as a football team, but specifically Tim Lester and the offensive side of the football. And that's where I kind of want to start with my very first takeaway. When I look at Iowa and where they are offensively and who they are and what they are, I almost feel like they're Caleb Johnson or bust on the offensive side of the football. Because when I look at what Iowa did well on Saturday, okay, because the floor has certainly been raised. This is not a Deacon Hill type of offense. This is not a Spencer Petras type of offense, although Cade McNamara still has some skills left to be desired. I don't think this is going to be the very last bottom feeder type of offense that in college football that it's been the last few years. A big reason because of that is because of number 2 in the backfield, because of Caleb Johnson. When they got him going, specifically on those toss sweeps, man, so Vince Lombardi might be a little bit jealous the way they were executing that toss sweep, right? That power sweep from those 1960s Packer teams. A seal here and a seal here. So they really got, and when they got that going, it opened up everything else offensively. But when that wasn't going, and maybe when they couldn't rely on Caleb Johnson carrying the load, because, in terms of the run game, right, you're not going to get 250 yards every single game, right? You're going to need to balance things out. You need other parts of your offense, certainly, to be able to step up and make some plays. And you saw what happened when maybe that was contained a little bit and maybe the pressure was put on Cade McNamara and this passing offense to be able to make plays down the field. It didn't really look that great, did it? It did it. No, it didn't. So although the floor has been raised at Iowa, there still are some things to be able to work on. And if they can't run the football during games the rest of the season, I think that they're going to have trouble moving the football on offense. When that run game gets going, so many other things open up offensively. But it just feels like there's so much pressure on Caleb Johnson or whoever's in the backfield, because we've talked about before that they have a plethora of running backs. Kamari Moulton, right, got the nod early on during the season. But I think it's very apparent now that Caleb Johnson is certainly that guy. And I think Caleb Johnson can be a great Big Ten running back. He can be a 1,000-yard back this season. And I almost think for Iowa to get to maybe a 9 or a 10-win level, he's going to need to be that kind of guy. So I'm curious to see how defenses approach the Iowa Hawkeyes the rest of the season, crowding the box, make them beat you over the top, right? And I'm sure that's how they defended them in the past as well, right? With these offenses, with the Petrases and the Deacon Hills as well. One big talking point that I want to make sure I get to is, man, that lack of a killer instinct, right? There were multiple times where Iowa was doing well offensively, able to drive the ball into the red zone, and the key was just not being able to finish. Not being able to finish with touchdowns and settling for some field goals. Okay, when you get down to that area, you've got to be able to finish. You've got to have that killer instinct to be able to finish drives. And when you're ahead 13-0 during a game, and let's call a spade a spade. This should have been 17-0, probably going into the half, but they didn't get it done. They had to settle for some field goals. But nonetheless, at 13-0, 0, a goose egg in the first half, you've got to find that killer instinct to finish the football game, to come away with the victory. However you do it, you've got to find a way to do it. Okay, so whether it's finishing drives or just finishing a game, that killer instinct to put a team away right away in the second half and not allowing them to get back into a football game, that's something that Iowa certainly needs to work on. When you get an opponent into that position, you need to be able to put them away. Now, here's some things that killed Iowa, right? Because we talk about their defense all the time. We know that they've got a really good secondary, but when you look at Iowa over time and they take on a more athletic football team, specifically a team with receivers that can get over the top, they can, not saying they do all the time, but they can struggle with maybe some faster, more athletic, some quicker teams out on the perimeter. Like you look at Jalen Noel, you look at Higgins throughout this game, double moves just killed them. They just killed them, right? Eventually it seemed like that was going to happen and Iowa State was going to dial it up. And boy, when they dial it up, they made it count. So Iowa's got to find a way to be able to contain those big plays over the top, because that was, when you look at this game between Iowa and Iowa State, that might have been the difference, is Iowa's ability defensively to prevent some of those big-time plays from happening over the top. And Rocco Beck, we talked about in the preview, okay, a big key was Iowa's ability to contain this passing game. And although the first half wasn't great, like a lot of lateral type of passing concepts, shorter type of passing concepts for Iowa State, once they got it going down the field and they made those adjustments in the second half, I think they saw a matchup that they could exploit, and they certainly did. Now, there's an opportunity for Iowa to certainly come back from this. It's a 1-point loss, very similar to Minnesota's loss against North Carolina. We'll see how good Iowa State is. Remember, this is a game that kind of exists within its own universe. Just because you win it doesn't mean you're going 10-2. Just because you lose it doesn't mean you're going 5-7. So this is a great opportunity for Iowa to kind of learn from this. And you got Minnesota, a big rivalry game in a couple of weeks. So we'll see how that one ends up as well. But for Iowa, for me, it's all about that killer instinct, and you need more diversity on the offensive side of the football. Now, I want to move on to something that's kind of been on my mind for a good amount of time, and something that I've been thinking about for over a year. But now that these programs and their coaches have a year under their belt, and now we've gone through a spring, we've gone through an off season, we've gone through fall camp, we've gone through some recruiting and some transfer portal cycles as well, it almost seems like the pendulum is leaning one way or another compared to these two programs. Now, Wisconsin and Nebraska both fired their coaches in the middle of the season in 2022. And they hired their current head coaches just 5 days apart, and I and a lot of others applauded both of these hires. Matt Rhule getting hired to be the head coach at Nebraska, and Luke Fickell being hired the head coach at Wisconsin. Now, both of these programs, both of these teams are going to be compared so much because of the nature of how these coaching changes happened and when they happened and how similar they were. But now that we've gotten to where we've gotten, and the vibes around the Nebraska program following that big win over Colorado seem to be very, very high. The feeling of where this Nebraska team is and where they could be is a lot different from the feeling surrounding the Wisconsin Badgers and where they are and where they could be, which is very interesting because I think when both of these coaches took over, you could argue, and I think it's a very winnable argument, should I say, that Wisconsin was in a better spot with Paul Chryst and where he left them than where Scott Frost left Nebraska. Wisconsin needed modernizing their offense. Their whole program needed just a facelift. They needed to kind of get up with the times, kind of get up with speed. It was ever apparent that if Wisconsin stuck with Paul Chryst, they were going to keep on falling behind and falling behind and falling behind. Now, Nebraska, I thought, like, Scott Frost recruited top 25 classes. There was talent there. It's just Scott Frost couldn't keep them there, and Scott Frost couldn't develop this talent. Both Luke Fickell and both Matt Rhule are very good builders and are very good developers of programs. Now, when you take a look at where both of these programs and both of these coaches are, I think when it comes to these assistant coaching hires, Nebraska has won it just based on Tony White. One coordinator, I think, has given the victory to the Nebraska Cornhuskers right now. Because what Tony White has been able, what he did with that defense last year, and then what he's been able to do with that defense this year, right, on offense and on defense, Nebraska's defense is the best out of these four units. And it might not be particularly close. Right, he has taken this defense and built them up into one of the Big Ten's best units. And there are players that were recruited by Scott Frost, that played under Eric Shenander, right, that were in that era. And now Tony White comes in, he puts them in the right spot pre-snap, and he puts them into advantageous situations, and look what happens. Here you are. Now, there's one word that I want to touch on. Identity. And I think that's really the core talking point. When you talk about where Wisconsin is, and then when you talk about where the Wisconsin Badgers are. When you looked at Wisconsin for 30 years, Barry Alvarez, Brett Bielema, we'll forget about Gary Anderson, and Paul Chryst, what did you know? What was the identity of Wisconsin football? It was NFL offensive linemen up front, big guys. They could churn out those types of talents year in and year out. And it was RBU. You know you were always going to have a great running back at Wisconsin, and then you had a really good defense to lean on. It was great and elite in that 3-4 scheme with Jim Leonard as well. Now, what's the identity of Nebraska now? Nebraska is a team that is built upon one of the best defenses in the Big Ten, a top 10 to top 15 defense in college football. They are built on physicality, great line play. They want to run the football right at you. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It's not a complete copy and paste, but it's very similar to the type of mindset that Wisconsin had for all of those years. Now, here's another question. What's the identity of Wisconsin football? What's the identity? When you look back at Luke Fickell's teams at Cincinnati, right, those were really good defensive football teams. And I think this defense is still lacking some sort of identity. You know, I think the whole thing with Wisconsin is that this is more of a long-term build than it is for Matt Rhule over at Nebraska, because they've switched from that scheme under Jim Leonard, and now they've gone to a 3-3-5 type of scheme. And man, you look at that defensive line for Wisconsin, it's got some work to do. It's got some work to do. You know, losing James Thompson Jr., it doesn't help anybody. But when you look at, we talked about at the top of the segment, the vibes of these two programs are very different based on what's happened really the first 2 weeks, where Nebraska has looked impressive. They looked impressive against UTEP, a G5 team, in which they should have looked impressive. And then they looked really good, of course, against Colorado. But you compare it on the other side to the Wisconsin Badgers. A 4-quarter game against Western Michigan and a 4-quarter game against South Dakota. And I think at bits and pieces during some of those games, maybe more than others for some of these teams, that Western Michigan and South Dakota were able to control the line of scrimmage, or at least draw even to maybe with what Wisconsin was trying to do if you factor in the entire 60-minute game as well, which is not going to happen to a team like Nebraska. It wouldn't have happened to a team in the past like the Wisconsin Badgers. Now, okay, maybe we're forming a new identity. Maybe your identity is the dairy raid. Maybe our identity is what Phil Longo brings to the offensive side of the football. Now, last year, I think we learned just how drastic of a change it was going to be from Wisconsin lining up 2 tight ends, 12 personnel, running the football, establishing the toughness and physicality at the line of scrimmage to this type of offense. Now you fast forward to this year, I think it looks better. But once again, this seems more because of the drastic changes on the offensive schemes and the defensive schemes. This seems more of a long-term build at Wisconsin than maybe what they're doing in this short-term flip right now at Wisconsin. But offensively, what's Wisconsin's identity? Okay, because there's been times where they kind of look like the Wisconsin of old. There were times that, during those first couple of drives against Western Michigan where one drive, I think, went 16 plays down the field, and they are just churning the ball. You've got Tawee Walker, you've got Ches Malusi. You saw Cade Yakimelli, right, get involved against South Dakota and gain some momentum in the run game as well. But then you see other times where they try to spread it out, and they try to throw the football and gain some momentum that way. I think Wisconsin is still trying to formulate who they are. And the identity piece, I think, is why Nebraska is ahead of the game right now and why they feel that they are in a better situation than the Wisconsin Badgers right now. Now, this is certainly not an all is lost for Wisconsin, but I just think this thing in Madison is maybe going to take a little bit longer to get to that 8-win level, to get to that 9-win level than anticipated. And I think a big part of them getting to that level quicker, sooner rather than later, is making this Phil Longo thing work. Now, I think the jury's still out. I think I'm putting it kindly that way. I think the jury's still out on if Phil Longo and this scheme is going to work. I know a lot of other people have maybe more harsher opinions than that when it comes to Phil Longo. But if this thing doesn't work, and if they can't get in a rhythm this year, maybe they go 6-6 or whatever, and they have to make a move and bring in a new offensive scheme, now you're kind of starting back at square one. And now the first 2 years of completely flipping this scheme, now you're just going back to something else. And now you're back behind the 8 ball once again offensively. So, as of right now, I'd say yes. Nebraska is in a better situation for now and for the future, although both teams are recruiting very well. But the difference may be Nebraska's got a 5-star quarterback and Wisconsin does not. I want to finish this big nation talking about two teams with high expectations at the beginning of the season. I think one team maybe had higher expectations than the other, but these are teams that through 2 games have a good amount of question marks and have some looking in the mirror to do to figure things out, to try to get on a roll once we get to the middle of the season, once we get later in the season, because both of these teams have very stiff tests when we get to that point in this season. All right, I want to talk first about the Oregon Ducks. Oregon, are you doing okay? Oregon, are you doing all right? Well, we're going to answer that question here. Now, when you look at last season and the great offensive output that the Oregon Ducks had last season, a big reason, now there was many reasons why that offense was great, but a big reason why is their offensive line. This offensive line that was able to protect Bo Nix and was one of the best offensive lines in all of college football last season. This season, they've allowed 7 sacks through 2 games. Now, we saw the offensive line with their issues against Idaho. And I think the talking point coming into this game against Boise State this last Saturday was, it's a fluke, whatever, let's just get it corrected and let's take care of business, statement win against the Broncos. It didn't happen. Boise State was able to get Dylan Gabriel moving back there. They were able to get pressure. And, the first thing that I think of, I know that we have the injury to Matthew Bedford, and I know that there has been some moving chess pieces on this Oregon offensive line. And I get that. And then I understand how much of an impact that will make. But the strengths of the Oregon offensive line coming into this season were the tackles. Josh Connerly and Johnny Cornelius, they were very confident in their ability at the tackle position. Now, I know pass protection it's a 5-man unit, right? It's a 6-man unit. It's a 7-man unit, right? It's not just 2 guys. But, of course, the building blocks of your pass protection are going to be your 2 tackle spots. And you felt that those 2 tackles were really, really good for Oregon. And I think the surprising part of what's happened with Oregon's offensive line is that pass rush coming off the edge and sometimes beating some of these really good offensive tackles. So I know there's been some shuffling, and I know that has an impact on this, But I think the most surprising part out of all of this has been what's been going on at the offensive tackle spot as well. Now, that is the concern. Of course, what's happening on the offensive line. There are some concerns maybe on the defensive side of the ball, but I really want to stay right now on the offensive side of the ball when I talk about the Oregon Ducks. Yes, there may be a concern up front on the offensive line. Yes, they need to find a way to either correct that and correct it soon, or they need to find a way to work around it. The good thing is, and we saw this in this game against Boise State, okay, because that's what a lot of it, and it wasn't just the offensive line, but the entire team. Okay, we saw what we saw against Idaho. Let's take a step up and let's prove some things and let's improve in week number 2 against the Broncos of Boise State. I think in this game against Boise State, we saw what Oregon can be. We saw that Oregon can be and a very explosive football team. Evan Stewart over the top. We saw what Tez Johnson can do, not only on offense, but on special teams in the return game as well. We saw that explosiveness that exists within the Oregon Ducks. Now, we have this offensive line issue. And of course, it is a big issue for longer developing pass plays in pass protection. But if there's one offense that's maybe built to maybe work with maybe some of these issues, it's Oregon. Because what is Will Stein's offense? What do they really want to be able to do? They want to be able to get rid of the football quickly. They want to be able to get the ball to their athletes in space. And boy, I mean, we saw it against Boise State. They got athletes. They got some of the best athletes in the country. Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden, right? Gary Bryant still coming back from an injury. But once they get all of those guys at full strength, obviously a good amount of them are at full strength already. And then I haven't mentioned at the tight end position. I haven't mentioned at Kenyon Sadiq, right? We saw, even once again, we come back to the offensive line, even though there's some issues there, even in the run game as well. We saw the explosiveness and we saw what we know Jordan James can be as well. Look, Oregon is not all of a sudden, because of these issues. Okay, if you think Oregon is all of a sudden going to be out of the playoff picture or out of the Big Ten championship picture or even out of the national championship picture, you need to slow your roll. You need to open your eyes a little bit because, I know they do have some issues to fix. I don't want to say that they don't have issues to fix. They certainly do. This is maybe not the team we expected them to be. And I think Oregon's issues that they need to solve maybe can open the door for other Big Ten contenders to maybe step up when we all thought, myself included, that it was going to be Ohio State and that it was going to be Oregon, lock them up for Indianapolis at the end of the year. And that's just the way it's going to be. But don't think now that Oregon all of a sudden just won't be in that picture. They're going to be in that picture. They just have little things to figure out. And I think in today's day and age of college football where you have more moving pieces, I think than you did before, more new guys coming into your program, you have this kinds of things. So if they can't really get those offensive line issues figured out, Will Stein and this offensive coaching staff needs to figure out a way to neutralize and how to get the ball quicker to some of their athletes over there in space as well for the Oregon Ducks. This is still a really, really good team, folks. Do not sell your stock on the Oregon Ducks. They are going to be in a championship picture at the end of the season. All right, let's talk about the Michigan Wolverines. Because 31-12, it was not pretty in more ways than one for Michigan. Now, I've gotten my negative out of the way as it pertains to Michigan. Go watch it if you're a glutton for punishment, right, so to speak. Go watch my reaction from Saturday. But now it's time to look ahead. It's time to focus on the future because Michigan has a game against Arkansas State, and then they play the USC Trojans. All of a sudden, that USC game is looking pretty daunting for the Michigan Wolverines. They got to use this week, building up to Arkansas State, to be able to fix some things. What do they need to fix? First things first, They need to use that performance against Texas as a wake-up call. You need to be able to look in the mirror and say, we got to figure things out. Because if we don't figure things out, and if we don't build that momentum and the confidence against Arkansas State, we have a USC team that can come in here and they can beat us. And all of a sudden, we're staring 500 in the face early in the season. All of a sudden, we're staring at 2-2. And we don't want that. Nobody wants that, right, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They want to be able to continue on their track record that they've laid over the last couple of years. But this is a completely different team. I think we all know that by now. If you didn't know it before Texas, you certainly know it now. This is a very different team, and maybe the approach needs to change just a little bit. Now, fixes. What do we need to fix? I think the first thing is the identity of Michigan football has been the offensive line and has been the run game. And those have taken clear steps back. I think the thing that they have to do against Arkansas State, get that confidence up, figure things out on the offensive line, figure things out in the run game. Donovan Edwards has not been very good these first 2 weeks. Okay, Donovan Edwards was a guy that we were looking at can be a 1,000-yard rusher. Donovan Edwards could maybe lead the Big Ten in rushing. I know that there were some rumblings coming out of camp that Khalil Mullings was going to work his way into an RB1 role, and it could really be migrating towards that. And maybe this week is figuring that out, figuring exactly who and what you want to invest in as it comes to the run game. Now, when you're looking 2 weeks ahead of time, you're looking at that game against the USC Trojans, all right? All of a sudden, USC, they can play against your offensive line. They can buck up, and they can push you. I'm not going to say they can push you around, but they can at least create a stalemate like they did against the LSU offensive line, okay? And if USC's front plays like they did against LSU, they play like that against Michigan, USC is going to have a pretty good time. So you need to be able to fix what you have on the offensive line and the run game because that's been the identity. You need to get back to doing what Michigan does best because it was proven, I think even proven during the Fresno State game, but certainly proven during the Texas game that if you can't run the ball and if you can't smash, as Sharon Moore likes to say, if you can't do that, J.J. McCarthy's not there to save you this year. Okay, he's not there to save you on a 3rd and 8. He's not there to save you on a 3rd and 9. This past game with Davis Warren, I think it's very apparent that it will be better if this run game is the primary focus and this offensive line improves and they're able to road grade and they're able to establish once again that Michigan identity of toughness and physicality up front. Because all of a sudden, okay, whether it's Arkansas State or whether it's USC or whoever it is the rest of the season, I talked about that blueprint to beating Michigan that both Fresno State and Michigan games have shown, is that if you can come up to the line of scrimmage and contain and stop this run game, Michigan cannot beat you over the top. So you need to be able to get that confidence back in your identity of who you are as a football program, because if you don't, all the pressure then goes onto the shoulders of Davis Warren to create plays down the field. I'm not sure how confident I am at this point in time. It still kind of baffles me a little bit that now I don't know if they looked into the transfer portal. I don't know if their NIL was not in the correct situation to bring in a transfer quarterback. But considering now what we've seen through 2 games, I thought, like, you look back at my stuff months ago. I said, Michigan is going to be the buyer of all buyers at the quarterback position in the transfer portal market. And they weren't. Maybe they believed in what they have. Maybe we just haven't seen it yet. Maybe there's still some developing to do. Maybe there's some talent within Davis Warren, and maybe the combination with Alex Orji and the balance that he can have in some Wildcat type of stuff as well. Maybe there's something there. And maybe it needs to be developed, and maybe Sharon Moore and this offensive coaching staff needs to be able to bring that out of some of these quarterbacks as well. So that's what they need to be able to fix on offense. If they can't fix it, there's going to be games later on in the schedule that aren't Oregon, that aren't Ohio State, right? That aren't USC, that aren't some of these games that could still be challenges for Michigan football. They need to dial up the pressure. Okay, now this Texas offensive line is a really, really good offensive line. And we talked about the Michigan defensive line and how interesting of a matchup that would be. Texas obviously certainly won that matchup. But all we're hearing about this offseason is Wink Martindale and the pressure and the pressure and the pressure and the pressure. I want to see it. I want to see it against Arkansas State. I want to see them eat. That's what I said about the Nebraska offensive line. I thought they were going to eat against Colorado. I want to see Michigan's defensive line eat against Arkansas State. Because when you look at that matchup against USC in a couple of weeks, if they can't eat, if their defensive line can't get pressure against the Trojans, based on what we've seen against Fresno State and Texas, it could be a long day for the Michigan Wolverines against the Trojans. So, get that run game going, dial up the pressure, get those two things right, and you got to feel like you'll be in a much better situation going forward and have a much better chance when USC comes to town in a couple of weeks. Week 2 has officially, the book on Week 2 has officially been closed here on Big Nation. Thursday, we've got mega picks and previews. We're breaking down Notre Dame, Purdue. We're breaking down Alabama. It's going to Madison to take on the Wisconsin Badgers as well. Probably throwing a UCLA and Indiana preview in there as well. We keep on churning, folks, in the Big Ten season, and you know where to dial it to. The Big Ten 10 social channels, and right here, Big Nation as well. So until Thursday, I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next edition of Big Nation.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.